So Miss Marvel is the newest Disney Plus Marvel show, and right out of the bat, if you haven't seen the show, pause this video, leave right now, because this will be a spoiler review. Okay, you've been warned. Now, jumping right into my spoiler review, the first thing I will say is that I thought Miss Marvel was very, very mediocre. I thought the story was very messy, I thought the villains were terrible, and yeah, I thought the show as a whole never came together for me. Like, even though there are things that I really did like, as a whole, I thought this show was, a huge, huge mess. That said, I will begin being positive, and I will begin with the stuff that I liked about this show. And when it comes to the stuff that I liked, the first thing that I have to mention is the visual style and, the visuals throughout the show. I love the way in which this show mixed animation with live action. I thought that was very inspired and very, very cool. I loved the opening sequence where you have Kamala Khan making this YouTube video that is part animated, part live action, and you have stop motion animation mixing with conventional animation, and she's just professing her love towards Captain Marvel. So I thought that opening sequence was very cool, very charming. Also, there is a sequence where, she's walking down the street with Bruno and they are talking about her potential costumes and, what she should dress up as. And while she's talking about that, you see the graffitis in the background coming to life and, turning into the different characters that she's imagining. And once again, I thought that scene was also really, really cool. So in regards to the visuals and the style of the show, I honestly have no complaints. I love this style. I love how inventive it is. I love how much it reminds me to stuff like Into the Spider-Verse. I love how they play with different mediums and different types of animation. I really like the way this show looks. Another thing that I really liked about this show is how authentic it feels to this culture and this group of people. Like, if I'm being honest, I don't know much about Pakistani and Indian history, so I really liked how authentic this show was and, how much it taught me about their past and about their history, I was very impressed by how much this show taught me about partition and about all of these moments in history that, if I'm being honest, I didn't know much about. So yeah, I really like the authenticity and I really like exploring this different corner of the MCU that we haven't seen before. I also really liked Avengers Con. I thought that was a very inspired idea and I really loved seeing it in the first episode of the show. And I also really loved some of the supporting characters. I thought Kamala's entire family was really freaking great. I loved Bruno. I thought he was very charming and a really cool guy. I love Nikia. What a great friend. I also really like the Sheik Abdullah. And I even really like Zoe. I thought Zoe ended up being a pretty good character. That said, the main thing that I loved about this show and the main character that I loved about this show is without a doubt Iman Vellani as Miss Marvel. I thought she was great. I thought she was extremely charming. And yeah, I thought Iman Vellani did a terrific job as this character with what she was given. And the first thing that I have to mention when it comes to Miss Marvel are her new powers. Because yes, the powers that she has in these Disney Plus TV show are not the same than the powers that she used to have in the comic books. But honestly, that worked. That wasn't a problem for me. And the reason why that worked for me is because the previous powers never really worked for me in the comics. They looked very silly. They looked very weird. And yeah, they looked unoriginal and uninspired due to the fact that we already have Captain Fantastic. We already have an elastic person. We don't need a second elastic person. So yeah, her powers in the comics never really quite worked. So I was honestly open to seeing what they did with her new powers in the show. And I think they did a good job. I like her new powers. I like her new abilities. I like how they look. And yeah, I really like them. I also really like the way they changed the origins of her powers in the show. In the comics, she's an Inhuman and she has the Inhuman gene and there's, a bunch of other stuff going on. That said, I like the fact that in the show, at least at first, in the first few episodes, it is revealed that her powers come from a pair of magical bracelets that have been passed on from generation to generation. I thought that was really cool. I thought that was really simple, and I don't think you needed more explanation. Now I will move on to discussing the things that I didn't really like that much about this show, and the first thing that I will say is, once again, the origin of her powers. The origin of her powers started very simple, very tidy, very neat. That said, as the show progressed, the origin to her powers started getting so freaking convoluted that by the end of the show, I honestly don't know where her power comes from. Like, in the first episode, in the first few episodes, they tell you that her powers come from this magical bracelets. As the season progresses, they tell you that she has powers because apparently she's a djinn, which, fine, sure, whatever. But not only because she's a djinn, but also because she comes from a different dimension called the Nur dimension, and apparently she's tapping into the energy from this different dimension. Sure. Then they also add an extra layer of complexity by saying that, Kamala's magical bracelets are somehow related to the 10 rings. After all, we see, the 10 rings markings on the floor when the villains are looking for Kamala's bracelets. So then they also add that level of complexity. And then, at the very end, in the last episode, just to make it all so much more complex, they end up revealing that Kamala also has powers because apparently she's a mutant. And, oh boy, I wasn't a fan of Kamala being turned into a mutant by the end of this show. First of all, I love the theme song. I love hearing that theme song. When Bruno said the word mutation and you heard that little... That was really, really cool, and I like that song. That said, why? Why did you need to turn Kamala into the first mutant? Wasn't there already enough going up with this character? Wasn't it enough that she had A, magical bracelets that are somehow related to Shang-Chi, that B, she's a freaking djinn from a different dimension, and now on top of that, she's also a mutant? You didn't need this. You didn't need that extra piece of information. It felt forced, it felt cheap, and honestly, it felt a bit disappointing. This is how mutants get introduced to the MCU? Not with a bang, but with a whimper. Just, somehow some guy being like, hey, you're a mutant, by the way. You have a mutation. I don't know. I wasn't a fan about that. Especially because at first it seemed like they changed the origins of her powers from the comic books in order to make them more streamlined and in order to make them more simple. But at the end, the origin of her powers in the show ended up being just as complex, if not more, than the origin of her powers in the comic books. So yeah, I wasn't a fan of that, and I thought that was a bit messy. Now, another element that I really didn't like about Ms. Marvel was the story, and I thought the story of this show was an absolute mess. And yeah, it felt very disjointed, it felt like a mess, and it felt like two different stories just crammed into one. So, here's what I mean with that. So, the first few episodes of Ms. Marvel are building up a storyline. They're building up this story of Kamala being this brown girl from Jersey who gets powers and is trying to figure out what her powers are and, how she can use them for good. That is the story that is set up in the first two episodes. Then, in episode 4 and episode 5, that story completely disappears, and instead we go in a completely different adventure, in a completely different continent, with a completely different set of characters. And this new storyline has nothing to do with Kamala learning about her powers and, learning how to use her powers for good. It is more about Kamala learning about her family and learning about her backstory. And that is fine. It is good. But it feels so jarring in contrast to the story that they were setting up at the very beginning. That said, the worst thing that they do in these two episodes is that by the end of episode 5, you completely kill off the characters that have been set up as the villains for the first 5 episodes, and then in episode 6, when you come back to the first story, you come back to the story that you were setting up in the first few episodes, you try to conclude the story, but now suddenly you don't have villains anymore. So what do you have to do? They had to manufacture some cheap conflict and they had to turn someone into a new villain, and it just came out of nowhere. It felt very cheap, it felt very forced, and it honestly didn't work. Now, other elements that I didn't think worked quite well from the show are some of the supporting characters. I thought the Red Daggers were very generic and uninspired. I thought Cameron was way too one-dimensional. And once again, they turned him into a villain out of nowhere in the final episode, and that was very disappointing. And that brings me to my main thing that I really didn't like about Ms. Marvel, and that is the villains. I thought the clandestines, the villains of this show, were so freaking bad. I honestly believe they are some of the worst villains Marvel has ever created. I would put them up there with Malekith, Ronan the Accuser, and whoever Guy Pearce was playing in Iron Man 3. I would put the Clandestines up there with those people as some of the worst villains Marvel has ever created. They were dull, they were bland, they were uninteresting, they were extremely one-dimensional, they were just very, very boring generic villains. And honestly, we know nothing about the Clandestines. Like, apart from the fact that they want to open a portal to a different dimension, we know absolutely nothing about them, and that just made them so boring and so bland. And, sure, Ronan the Accuser might be a terrible villain, but at least he looks visually interesting. At least he looks cool. The Clandestines don't even look cool. They are just people who are evil and they want to open a portal, and that's it. They were so boring, so dull, so dumb, I frankly didn't like them. And I know I said that the villains was going to be the last thing I was going to mention in regards to the things that I didn't like about Ms. Marvel, but, I was lying. There's something else that I need to mention, and that is the CGI. I wasn't a fan of the CGI in this show. I felt like some of the CGI of Ms. Marvel's powers was very weak, was very, yikes. Like, that's the only way I could describe it. There is one last thing that I have to mention when it comes to this show, and that is the post-credit scene. And what the hell happened? What the hell was the post-credit scene? I don't know. I don't know if I'm missing something, but I am very confused about what happened. Kamala is just chilling in her room, and then suddenly she changes into Captain Marvel. Did she shapeshift? Did Captain Marvel and Kamala swap places? I have no idea. It seems like they swapped places because, Captain Marvel seems very confused of where she's at. But I don't know. It just felt... This post-credit scene felt like a very cheap way to set up the Marvels and to bring Captain Marvel into this story. It felt like an afterthought. It felt very cheap, and it's like, okay, here you go. Here's your setup to your next film. So yeah, I wasn't a big fan of the post-credit scene. It was a bit confusing, and it felt a bit cheap. So yeah, in conclusion, I thought Ms. Marvel was very, very mediocre. If I were to give it a score in between 1 and 10, I would give it a 5 out of 10, which means I think it was meh.